best we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and today we discuss a matter of public interest, of interest particularly to more than half of the population, women, and of course, boys and girls as well. It's a question of sexual violence, and it so happens that at this point in time, this point in the history of Guyana, the Chancellor of the Judiciary is a woman, the Chief Justice is a woman, the Chief Magistrate is a woman, and I feel these three women are the right people in the right place at the right time to make an impact on the reduction of sexual violence in the country. I say this because the Chancellor of the Judiciary, the Chief Justice, and the Chief Magistrate can help to use the judicial system to ensure there are more convictions for persons who are accused of various forms of sexual violence. The Chancellor herself, Madam Yolanda Cummings Edwards, opened the first sexual offenses court in Guyana in November 2017. And since then, she has been able to report that there's been an increase in the rate of convictions against offenders. And last year, there were 298 reports of rape, more than 5 a week, occurring in Guyana. I do believe that the presence of these three women at the pinnacle of the judicial system, Chancellor, Chief Justice, and Chief Magistrate, could bring their gender to bear on the way that sexual violence is perceived in our country. Of course, sexual violence is criminalized under the law, but over the years, the definition of sexual violence has moved away from that four-letter word rape. It doesn't mean, penile vaginal, insertion any longer. It means also unwanted sexual touching, various forms of sexual harassment. So the definition has not remained static over the last half century. Things have changed, and with good reason too. So we find now that any number of coercive or unwanted sexual acts, including sexual abuse of children, forced prostitution, and trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation, all of these offenses are liable to prosecution. Sexual abuse cases against children, and this is a real national tragedy, surged. There were 1,128 reports in 2021, and over half of them, bear this in mind, my friends, over half of them arose from incidents in the hinterland, particularly Region 1, that's Burima-Waini, Region 7, that is Kuyuni-Mazruni, Region 8, that is Pataro-Sepononi, and Region 9, the Rupununi. Of course, that's the biggest part of the country. Maybe per capita population is the lowest, but you're speaking about a very high number of sexual violence cases. 688 girls between the ages of 14 and 18, and 113 boys. And bear in mind, sexual violence is not a boy against girl, or man against woman. It's sometimes men against boys as well. 113 boys, ages 8 to 13, 8 to 13, was sexually abused in 2020. Sexual violence increased by 240% in the Burima-Waini region last year, 2022. And then again, you have reports of incest, which surged again in the hinterland regions 1, 7, 8, and 9. But very frequently, the families conceal the incidents. There's secrecy about the events, because very frequently they occur between adult males, sometimes family members, and children. The nieces and nephews, sometimes their own children. It's incest, and for that reason, nobody knows the exact amount, and for that reason, also, prosecutions are not keeping abreast with the actual crimes. Um, my friends, young persons inevitably and unfortunately are most at risk as victims of violence. Young persons in the age group 15 to 24 endure the highest rates of every type of sexual violence. Older persons, age 55 to 64, report the least incidents of violence. But the fact is that 20% of women and girls endure some form of non-partner sexual abuse in their lifetime. 13% reported enduring such abuse before the age of 18. This is according to the UNDP. So these facts are documented internationally. These are not, from private sources or from the police. These are international statistics. And when you look at what is happening in the courts, and that's why at the start of this program, I call attention to the fact that the Chancellor, Chief Justice, and Chief Magistrate are in positions to help to curb sexual violence. 54% of criminal cases in the Demerara Magisterial District arose out of sexual violence. 54%. This is more than robbery and, other forms of assault. Sexual violence, over half of the cases before the Demerara Magisterial District. 48% in the Berbice Magisterial District. That is using the old colonial boundaries, when Berbice was a county. And in Essequibo, that is the rest of the country, 56% in the Essequibo Ministerial District. So you can see that this crime of sexual violence is not going away. And although the judiciary and the magistracy have been able to secure a large number of convictions, more evidence is emerging that more crimes are being committed. Unfortunately also, and this is a big tragedy, that it is that in all three ministerial districts, the sexual offenses against minors, these people under the age of 18, have been increasing. My friends, sexual violence not only is a crime, but the conviction rates are low. Why is this so? This is so because, well, for one, there are insufficient rape kits in the hospital. Of course, the rape kits help to determine the fact that there has been sexual abuse, and it can help in tracing the DNA. There are not enough in the hospitals, especially in the hinterland hospitals where a lot of these offenses are taking place, some of them incest. And I can tell you that when you see the young girls who go into hospital to get babies, they can only be getting babies as a result of rape, because some of them are too young to consent. Some of them should be playing litty instead of getting babies. Some of them should be at school writing NGSA exams or something like that. But they're not ready for motherhood. In addition to that, there is sometimes inadequate identification of the assailants. And if a person is raped in a dark burial ground or a street or something, maybe the assailant can't be properly identified. Sometimes there's insubstantial evidence at the time of investigation, when, of course, the investigator is looking for hard facts. It is difficult to try to interrogate a young woman or a young man who has been brutalized and not in the right senses at that time. Sometimes the prosecution is inept, and you have to worry about that. Sometimes matters go to the court, and the prosecution, has such a weak case that the assailant is frequently exculpated. And because, as I mentioned a minute ago, the jurors themselves might not be aware of the changes in the nature of sexual offenses. It is not just penile vaginal penetration. There is now a wide range of offenses which can be constituted as sexual violence. I mean, even between husband and wife. You know, even some forms of touching could be regarded as violence or harassment. But the jurors may not be fully educated um, in what now constitutes in 2023 sexual violence. And the jury system is sometimes there's ignorance. I use the word ignorance to indicate that they simply don't know. I'm not suggesting that they're stupid or anything, but they simply don't know what changes have taken place in the law. Then there's the indecisive attitude of some of the victims themselves, that they don't want to expose themselves, they don't want to face the embarrassment, as we know. Within recent memory, a girl at a well-known Quarantine High School was raped by a taxi driver, and she was so embarrassed that she killed herself. She was so embarrassed that she killed herself. And some of them don't want to face the court. They don't want to face the assailant. They don't want to think about the agony that they experienced. They don't want to relive that experience. And you can understand why some of the victims are either undecided or indecisive. And sometimes victims, choose to discontinue the case. They just don't want to offer evidence. So the fact is that 38% of rape cases only in 2020, 33% in 2021, and 30% in 2022. You can see the figures declining, ended up in convictions. Even though the APNU-AFC coalition established the Sexual Offences Court, the SOC, in 2017, and there's no one in Boabis, was established in 2019, the rate of conviction, although high, is still relatively low in relation to the amount of crimes being committed. Then, of course, my friends, there are societal factors. Some social norms still support subordination and misogyny against women. They tolerate sexual assault, and I think many older persons here growing up would remember the calypsos and other forms of dancehall music, which support a certain type of manliness, which is equivalent to aggressiveness and subordination, excuse me, of women. Then there's poor education, not only of children and families, but also of the law enforcement officers. And these have been associated with increasing sexual violence. So there are a lot of kids. I'm not saying these societal factors cause, but they create an environment, a permissive environment in which sexual violence flourishes. And I think there has been an outcry against certain types of music, even in Jamaica, which is the heartland of a certain type of dancehall music. Some songs have been banned, and although I know there are many activists who don't agree to banning news or banning music and so on, but some are very dismissive. Some are treat women in a very derogatory manner, and they encourage sexual violence, aggressive behavior, particularly by adult males and against women and children. So in addition to that, we have substantial evidence that the sexual violence committed against women and young persons, although attempts have been made to eradicate all forms of sexual violence, there has been a level of complicity and concealment of the crime. There's secrecy and silence in the families, and very frequently, too frequently, you find that women, adult women, are afraid to report these offenses to the police because the person who abused their children, their daughters, is in fact the financial support, the provider in the home. And if he was put away in jail, they fear that they won't be able to run their households. Uh, Very frequently, many persons close to the victims are themselves the perpetrators. And sometimes, unfortunately, and there's evidence to support it, that women, are prepared, and maybe the victims themselves are prepared to accept monetary compensation. Unfortunately, that monetary compensation cannot heal the wounds that young women and all women have to live with for the rest of their lives. Uh, my friends, let us look at the question of reducing sexual violence. There is certainly need for public education. Uh, and again, I refer to the APNUFC tenure of office between 2015 and 2020. And we had launched a media program called Cut It Out, an hour-long program. And of course, we promote the use of hotlines, which could help to identify and isolate persons who pose a threat to boys and girls. And when we speak about community policing or neighborhood policing, these are some of the functions of community and neighborhood policing because they are resident in the communities. These are not persons posted from the evil area or coming from outside the town. They know what is taking place. They know which households, which families, which widows are vulnerable and they're living in isolated areas. And it is the duty of this form of policing. And as you know, I've spoken about this before, I don't believe that community policing are uniform people who are going around with handcuffs and batons. These are people who interact with the communities and who find out where vulnerable girls and women are living. And we've had in the past cases in the Essequibo Islands, young girls going to school through a bushy track early in the morning were raped and murdered. Similarly, there was a very bad case a few years ago in Mocha Arcadia. Unemployed young people sit down looking at the girl day after day. And these are persons at risk. And neighborhood and community policing can do more to identify those risky cases and try to offer some protection. So the question of reducing sexual violence requires also better education and also enforcement. Education is important because legislation is changing. It doesn't stand still. And there's now a wide range of offenses and, of course, penalties and, of course, measures to protect victims during police investigation. And this is something that the non-governmental organizations have been pressing for, that you cannot expect a person who has, been violently assaulted sexually to go in a police station and simply report it over the counter. There must be some private, confidential place that people must be able to give evidence, by video or in some confidential place. And that is why we need more women police officers who are expected, just like the judiciary or the magistracy, women police officers are expected to be more sympathetic to victims of violence. And because of that, maybe we can hope that the victims would be prepared to speak to them in confidence. And I think that is one of the important factors in reporting this crime. In addition, my friends, we must look at other forms of education which not only deal with the expanded range of offenses, touching and harassment and using certain types of language, but also you must look at improved measures to protect victims during police investigation, so that the type of questioning is not deliberately demeaning or embarrassing. And of course, what happens in the court? because if sometimes, girls or women come against an aggressive trial lawyer, it could be very, not only embarrassing, but, it could be daunting, and the person just climb up and refuse to speak. Uh, and there must be also procedures to track offenders, because very frequently persons who are engaged in crimes of sexual violence uh, can turn out to be repeat offenders. And it means that if they commit an offense once, well, I'm not a psychologist, but there might be a tendency to repeat that offense if there's a chance that, they wouldn't be discovered. So once there's a conviction, that person has to be tracked. If that person is moving in from coastland to hinterland, if that person is involved in trafficking, if that person has, adopted a certain style of life, going to schools or driving minibuses, uh, there must be some way of tracking that person, so that person is not given the opportunity to commit the offense again. And there must be measures to protect the victims as well. Uh, and as I said before, uh, there have been so many changes in the law uh, that people have to be educated to be aware that sometimes the language they use, sometimes the the habit of touching, the songs they sing, the programs that are broadcast are not demeaning to women. All of these measures could be used to help to curb sexual violence, create a different atmosphere, one of respect rather than one of disdain and misogyny. The law is there, but the law cannot enforce itself. The law depends on police officers to enforce. And the most important law is, of course, the Sexual Offences Act, the SOA, and it defines a range of offenses: rape, grooming, statutory rape, harassment. And people don't understand statutory rape too, because when you, as I mentioned a minute ago, when you see a 12 or 13-year-old mother, teen mother, that person most likely has been the victim of statutory rape. And the Sexual Offences Act provides or caters for measures to punish all forms of sexual violence. And it prescribes terms of imprisonment, not only for summary offenses, but also for indictable offenses. And I think I think some rapists who have recently come before the courts are surprised at the severity of the sentences. And some of them even attempted to appeal to higher courts. And one went as far as the CCJ. But there's no relief. I think people in all of the courts, judicial officers in all of the courts, have started to take a very serious approach to sexual offenses. And apart from the act, there is, of course, the Domestic Violence Act, and women can find some remedy or some relief in the Domestic Violence Act, although it doesn't deal specifically with sexual offenses. It does provide for some remedies to women who have the right to seek prompt protection, and this is from the law. Unfortunately, in Ghana, as I pointed out, there is no way for them to go after they've been living for years, perhaps with an abusive spouse. And even if they get that order, you have to find out how they're going to make the living. And this is sometimes a dilemma for women who have suffered sexual violence. My friends, the courts are important. And that is why the APNUFC coalition established the first sexual offensive court in 2017, and the second one was established in 2019. And it has been able to expedite trials of sexual matters. And the Madam Chancellor, Janet Cummings Edwards, pointed this out. that there has been an impact on convictions because of the establishment of these courts. And there should be courts in all of the districts, particularly in the areas where sexual violence is highest. And this includes the hinterland, although the population is lowest. Where do we go from here? My friends, the laws should reflect, and we keep amending the laws. The law is not there forever. It has to be improved because society changes. When the original laws were drafted, there was no internet. Sometimes young children are exposed to a lot of sexual violence on the internet. And the laws must continue to reflect as accurately as possible, the changes that are taking place in human behavior. Sexual offenses, sexual violence is something very complex, and it includes removing negative stereotypes and myths, and also paying more attention to reflecting the experiences of the victims. You have to listen to the victims to know how traumatic sexual violence could be. Let me close by looking at three aspects of or three recommendations, you want to call it, to curb sexual violence. One is prevention, of course. Sexual violence is most likely to be endured by marginalized groups. That is very poor people, maybe even prostitutes, persons who have been trafficked, maybe children who might trust some of the elders. Other persons may have had negative interactions with the criminal justice system, and they don't want to get near to a court again. And it means that if we're going to implement measures, the measures must deal with these factors. Laws are necessary, but laws are not sufficient on their own to prevent sexual violence and deliver justice. Sexual violence, especially against boys and girls, it's not only a gender thing. Boys are increasingly being affected. And this could be helped if the parents played a more active role in teaching their children, training and educating their children about their bodies and about what constitutes legitimate touching. And this is something that's started early childhood. When you see what has been happening to some very young children, you realize that, even before they're 10 or 12, this type of education has to take place. Secondly, there must be better protection for victims, especially if those victims are vulnerable persons. And they must get assistance from the state, not just NGOs, the Marundi and the Help and Shelter and Red Thread. They must get protection from the state so that when violence occurs, they could be put in a safe place. There must be safe places for victims of sexual violence. And there must be a policy on the part of the police force, particularly to employ more women police officers on the assumption that they are likely to be more sympathetic to the victims of sexual violence. And it can work if you have in your police stations, safe places or secure places, and you have women police officers there. I think women who have been abused would be more comfortable to go to them, to those places and to those officers, than in going to, a police station, setting up an encounter waiting to give the evidence. And there must be more vigorous prosecution of sexual offenders. There have been a lot of dismissals, persons who have refused to give evidence against the assailants. And unfortunately, the prosecution rate has been low. And as I said earlier in this program, the amount of crimes, the amount of offenses has increased. And laws have to be enforced. And the enforcement of law requires public education about human rights. It requires training of the law enforcement officers, not a one-day seminar, not a workshop, not a symposium. It has to be embedded in the training that every police officer receives. And the functioning of the criminal justice system must be under constant review. My friends, victims of violence have no choice but to rely on the police force for enforcement and on the law and the courts of justice, to receive relief from this crime. And that is why I feel that the presence of a larger number of women in the judicial system, the magistracy and the judicial system, and also in the police force, is a good move to help to protect our women, our children, boys and girls, against sexual violence. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do